Picture this. It's July 1863. The streets of Manhattan erupt in chaos. Angry mobs tear through the city, torching buildings and targeting anyone who gets in their way. What started as a protest against the Civil War draft spiraled into one of the deadliest urban uprisings in American history. Over the course of 4 harrowing days, New York City became a battlefield, not between North and South, but between rich and poor, native-born and immigrant, black and white. The violence left over 100 dead, the city in ruins, and wounds that would take decades to heal. But why did it happen? How did a city celebrated as a beacon of opportunity become a stage for such brutal violence? And what does this forgotten chapter of the Civil War teach us about inequality, race, and the cost of war? These are the questions we'll be answering today on Learning Out Loud as we continue our American Rebellion series. I'm your host, Katie, and today we're diving into the 1863 Manhattan Draft Riots, a story of resentment, rebellion, and survival in the heart of America's greatest city. Now let's get into it. But first, some background, shall we? I feel like for telling historical stories, the background is just as important, if not more so, than the actual story itself. So to set the scene, the Civil War has been going on for about 2 years at this point. Just weeks before the Manhattan Draft Riots, the Union won 2 back-to-back victories that helped turn the tide in the war. On July 4th, the Union Army was able to capture Vicksburg, Mississippi. I think it's MS Mississippi. It is Mississippi. I like how in my own notes, I assumed that I would know the state abbreviations. Anyway, on July 4th, the Union Army was able to capture Vicksburg, Mississippi after a 47-day siege. It was strategically located along the Mississippi River, and with the Union victory, it gave them control of the river, which was a main route for trade, and it essentially split the Confederacy into 2. And notably, this campaign was led by Ulysses S. Grant. Around 1,600 men were killed during the siege, with casualties evenly split between the Union and the Confederacy. The second significant battle ended the day before on July 3rd, after a few days of battle, and this was the Battle of Gettysburg. The Union victory at Gettysburg stopped Robert E. Lee's attempt to invade the North, and Lee and his men fled back to Virginia. The Battle of Gettysburg had the largest number of casualties of the war, with around 50,000 men killed in total. Gettysburg is also famous for the Gettysburg Address that Abraham Lincoln gave several months later at the dedication ceremony for the Gettysburg National Cemetery. So let's now talk about New York, where the draft riots occurred. So between 1820 and 1860, 3.7 million immigrants landed in the New York harbor. Another immigrant coming up from the bottom. For reference, the population of New York City at the time was only 1 million. Many immigrants stayed in New York City, and a lot were from Ireland. The Irish famine that occurred between 1845 and 1851 saw over 500,000 Irish immigrating to the U.S. By 1860, 47% of New York City's population were foreign-born, with most of them being Irish. As you can imagine, life for an immigrant in New York City was not great. To keep up with the rising population, more and more tenements popped up in the city. Tenements usually had low rent, so they were popular living choices for immigrants, and it was common for families of 10 living in one 325 square foot apartment. Most of New York City did not have sewers at this time, so raw sewage was dumped into the streets, alleyways, basically anywhere outside of the home to get rid of it. If you've seen Gangs of New York, that is what New York City looked like at the time. And yes, I have seen the movie. Woo! Insert applause here. It's based on the book written by Herbert Asbury in 1928. Although some historians say his accounts were a bit exaggerated, but I feel like the atmosphere and general look is probably close enough. As the influx of immigrants into New York increased, a wave of nativist groups and political parties started popping up. In 1835, Samuel F.B. Morse created the first political party against immigration called the Native American Democratic Association. And I just kind of feel like that's a little bit of an ironic name. No? Native American? Were they really, though? This sentiment grew into the 1850s when other nativist groups sought to lengthen the period before immigrants could become citizens, vote, or hold public office. They also passed laws that protected, quote, Americans from immigrants competing for their jobs. Employers would put signs in their shop windows that read, quote, no Irish need apply. On top of this, German and Irish immigrants were also discriminated against for their religious affiliations, with most being Catholic. And as we talked about in the Leisler Rebellion episode, anti-Catholic sentiments were strong in the area as far back as the late 1600s. And again, isn't this ironic, this anti-immigration sentiment in the 1800s, and now we're seeing it again? That's why it's so important to study history, you guys. Despite all of this, immigrants in New York were able to make their own communities, and some Irish Catholic immigrants formed their own organizations. See Gangs of New York, and were able to gain some municipal power by the mid-1800s. But let's not forget, these anti-immigration ideals carried on in the general U.S. population with different laws like the Chinese Exclusion Act and a quota by country policy that lasted until 1965. And maybe that will be extended into what's happening now. Anywho, the New York government and law enforcement during this time were very corrupt and inefficient. New York City actually had two different police forces, and they would literally fight each other over who was allowed to police the city. This rivalry culminated in 1857 with a police riot where the Metropolitan Police Force fought with the locally raised municipal force. The police forces were divided ethnically, with the municipals being comprised of mostly Irish Catholic immigrants, and the metropolitans were mostly Anglo-Saxon Protestants. The worst of the fighting was, ironically, on the steps of the city hall, and hundreds were left beat up, 12 were seriously injured, and one was crippled for life. This also happened around the time of Tammany Hall period. Tammany Hall was a Democratic political machine that played a major role in controlling New York politics. We'll see the rise of infamous William Boss Tweed as a political boss of Tammany Hall just a few years after the draft riots. He and his cronies fixed elections, took bribes, and stole $45 to $200 million in city funds, which would be in the billions in today's money. Tweed accumulated so much land that he was the third largest landowner in New York City until his conviction on 204 counts of fraud. A little spoiler alert there for you. So yeah, that's the type of political landscape that New York City was during the 1860s. Another group we need to discuss is Black people living in New York City. Free Black people accounted for less than 2% of the city's population. Although New York banned slavery in 1827, which was the first state to do so, New York still heavily relied on slave labor. New York still dominated the illegal slave trade to the South, Brazil, and Cuba. It is estimated that up to 40% of the U.S. cotton revenue went through New York through its financial institutes, shipping businesses, and insurance companies. For example, New York Life Insurance Company and Aetna Incorporated, by the way, they are still the U.S. largest life and health insurance companies today. They sold policies that reimbursed enslavers for financial losses when the people they enslaved died. New York-based banks like Citizen Bank and Canal Bank, which later became J.P. Morgan Chase, and yes, those are still around today, they accepted enslaved people as collateral on loans and, quote, collected 1,250 Black people when plantation owners defaulted. So yeah, slavery may have been illegal in New York, but it still actively participated and profited off of it. And free Black people in New York City still faced violence, discrimination, segregation, and the threat of being kidnapped and sold back into slavery in the South. For example, in the summer of 1862, a mob of Irishmen attempted to burn down a tobacco factory in Brooklyn where 24 Black women and children were working. And just months before the draft riot, an Irish mob attacked 200 Black men who were working on the dock because the mob had refused to work with the Black men. And this is a little bit of foreshadowing of things to come in the following year. Interesting to note is that abolitionists were also harassed and discriminated against in New York City. They were attacked and had stones thrown at their houses. The Times once explained attendance at an abolitionist meeting this way, quote, "People go to hear them just as they would go to a bull baiting or rat killing match, as if these were respectable," end quote. The Herald denounced the 1850 convention of the American Anti-Slavery Society in the city as, quote, "the annual Congress of fanatics," end quote. And 10 years later, the same newspaper warned, quote, "Irish and German laborers, if Lincoln is elected today, you will have to compete with the labor of 4 million emancipated Negroes," end quote. There were even many city clergy who were actively hostile towards abolitionism. There was one documented incident of a New York minister citing scripture and said, quote, "Slavery is a divine institution," end quote. And then an abolitionist yelled out from his pew, quote, "So is hell," end quote. There was a lot of racial tension between Black and white people, but especially white immigrants who feared having to compete with Black people for jobs. This fear intensified when Lincoln delivered his Emancipation Proclamation at the beginning of 1863, which freed all enslaved people in the Confederacy only. Let's not forget that caveat, because the Union needed to appease the border states that sided with them, and they were slave states, and they got to keep their slaves. So, immigrants feared that if all enslaved people received freedom, they would have to compete with them when they were already having to compete with free Black people who were the cheapest form of labor. Because of these racial tensions and the financial ties to slavery, New Yorkers were not thrilled to be a part of the Union. And in early 1861, the mayor of New York City, Fernando Wood, even suggested seceding from the Union to become a, quote, "free independent city." All right, so now we've got a little bit of background of what was going on in the Civil War and New York City at this time. So let's get into the Manhattan draft riots. The U.S. government issued the National Conscription Act on March 3rd, 1863, and was the nation's first federal draft. For comparison, the Confederacy also enacted a draft the year before. And this Union Conscription Act stated that all able-bodied northern white males between the ages of 20 and 45 were eligible for the draft. All right, so now we find ourselves on July 11th, 1863, New York City. This is the first day of names being called for the Union military draft. And again, this is fresh off Union victories in Vicksburg and Gettysburg. The Union, aka the U.S. government military, was starting to freak out because although they had won these key battles, there were many, many casualties, and they needed to find ways to replenish their soldiers. The draft also allowed, and this is important, it allowed anyone to avoid the draft by paying a small fee of $300. It was also common for wealthy people to pay off poor people to substitute for them, and this was something that had been done in previous American-involved wars. This lent the Civil War to be called a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight. A couple future presidents' dads actually paid the $300. And those were Teddy Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt's dads. And just by the way, they're fifth cousins. And also FDR and his wife were also fifth cousins once removed. Anywho, later in life, Teddy admitted that he was embarrassed that his dad had done that. Other notables who paid the fee and I don't think anyone will be shocked by this. J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, and Andrew Carnegie, and also future President Grover Cleveland, who at the time was an assistant district attorney. He actually paid a 32-year-old Polish immigrant $150 to take his place, so at least he got to save some money, she said sarcastically. And it just makes me wonder what would the world look like if any of these men had gone to war? A poor man's fight indeed. The draft also unfairly targeted New York, according to modern historians, as it asked for more people from New York than any of the other states based on population percentage. The draft also made no exemptions for immigrants working toward citizenship, meaning that non-citizens could also be drafted. Many New Yorkers, rightfully so, thought that this draft was unfair, particularly immigrants and lower-class people who could not afford to pay the $300 fee. The draft was actually supposed to have happened sooner, but the governor of New York, Horatio Seymour, was not a fan of the draft and had postponed it as long as he could. And then on the 4th of July, he gave a speech that historian Rob Ellis called, quote, one of the most inflammatory speeches ever uttered by an American public official, end quote. Seymour said this, quote, remember this, the bloody, treasonable, and revolutionary doctrine of public necessity can be proclaimed by a mob as well as by a government, end quote. And then in typical political fashion, he booked it straight out of New York City and went on vacation. Kind of sounds familiar, doesn't it, Ted Cruz? Anyways, so things started off as a protest of the unfair draft when it finally did happen, but it quickly devolved into a racial massacre. The center point of the riots was the 5 Points District. Again, see Gangs of New York. It was named this because 5 streets intersected there, and let's just say it was not a great place to be. Here are some fun quotes about the 5 Points District. The first is from famous frontiersman Davy Crockett, who said after visiting, quote, I would rather risk my life in an Indian fight than venture among these creatures after night, end quote. And a Methodist bishop was quoted as saying, prostitutes were as numerous in the city as Methodists. The protest started with men destroying the draft lottery wheel, destroying documents, and setting the building on fire. There were some firemen who were part of the mob, and they actually prevented anyone from putting out the fire, and the entire block ended up burning down. There was a group of U.S. Army Invalid Corps who were still recuperating from battlefield wounds, but tried to help break up the mob. 1 soldier was killed, and 6 others further injured. At first, they tried blanks to scare off the crowd, but it seemed to have the opposite reaction, and the mob went nuts. The U.S. Army Invalid Corps was severely outnumbered and resorted to live rounds that killed or wounded 6 men and 1 woman. The mob overwhelmed them and killed upwards of 20 soldiers. The rest of the troops fled, leaving behind their wounded, who were then mutilated by the mob. The riots spread and mobs attacked symbols of wealth like high-end shops, police stations, arsenals, and also homes and property of Republican Party leaders. A crazy scene was the New York Times defending its building with its own employees who were armed with several Gatling guns that they had borrowed from the army. Another factor that did not help matters was that saloons remained open during this whole time, and alcohol further fueled the rioters' rage. And within a couple days of the riots first starting, the city was considered mob-ruled. The riot then started to take an even darker and more violent turn as rioters' anti-draft sentiments morphed into racist, anti-black rage. And over the course of the 4 days of rioting, even more violence occurred, now with the main targets being police and black people. The mob turned its attention to the neighborhood in Brooklyn called West New Brighton, which was known to have several black residents and was a neighborhood known for its abolitionist sympathies. It was even rumored that it was a stop in the Underground Railroad. The mob trampled and stoned to death several free black people in this neighborhood. The riots then spilled into Staten Island, where several prominent abolitionists lived, and they boarded up and fortified their homes and started watch guard shifts 24/7 in preparation for any attacks. The mob then attacked and burned down the colored orphan asylum that housed more than 200 black children under the age of 12 and was ran by 50 matrons and attendants. Luckily, some of the matrons were able to bar the front entrance as the mob grew close and evacuated the children and employees out the back. The mob eventually broke in, vandalized the building, and then set it on fire. Sadly, one little girl did not make it out with the others and was found by the mob hiding under a bed. They took her out and savagely beat her to death. At least 11 black men were killed in horribly brutal ways. Historian Ellis wrote, quote, "Fires were set here, there, and everywhere. Blacks were chased and cornered, strung up and tortured. Irish women knifed the flesh of the hanged men, poured oil into their wounds, set fire to the oil, danced under the human torches, and sang obscene songs." End quote. The mob burned down black boarding houses and a black church. Young white boys would mark the homes of black people by breaking a window in the home and then would bring back adults to those homes to drag out the owners of those homes to beat and or kill. There were also reports of several black longshoremen being murdered on the waterfront and their bodies being dumped into the river. Seeing all this violence, Protestant clergy gave refuge to black people fleeing the mobs, and merchant families protected and hid their servants. Many black and white people alike were trying to flee the violence of the city, but the railroads had been tampered with, and it was very hard to find any carriages or boats or means of escape. About 10,000 rioters tried storming police headquarters, but the police were able to hold their ground after 15 minutes of intense hand-to-hand combat before the mob finally fled. On the second day of fighting, Governor Seymour gave a speech saying the draft was being suspended and the military would fill their quotas through volunteers only. He asked everyone to peacefully go home. Some did, but not all. And of course, this is the mid-1800s, so there wasn't really a speedy way to let everyone know about this speech and decision by the military to stop the draft. Looting, arson, and violence continued. Federal troops from Gettysburg were assigned to stop the rioting, and they arrived on the third day. The mob fought with these federal troops for 20 minutes and completely defeated them. Several wounded soldiers were beaten to death by the mob. And let's just make this clear. These were federal troops who had survived the Battle of Gettysburg, and they were killed by a New York City mob. However, the tide was about to change because about 10,000 Gettysburg veterans arrived in the city and relieved the cops and divvied the city into 4 military districts and went to work stopping the mob. One of the articles I read said that every single cop had been injured in some way by the time the U.S. troops showed up. From how it's described, the fighting amongst the troops and rioters sounded like it was a war battle. There were snipers, barricaded defenses, with the military sweeping through areas engaging in fierce firefights. On the 4th day of fighting, the governor's plea to the mob was finally printed in all newspapers and urged everyone to stop the violence and get back to daily life. And by midnight, the Manhattan draft riots were officially over. Over the next few weeks, police and military swept through New York City slums and found over 11,000 firearms and other mob weapons and tens of thousands of dollars worth of stolen property. It is estimated that anywhere between 100 to 1,000 people were killed in the draft riots, but a common number is 125. Some reasons that it's so hard for historians to pin down the number is that many died in fires, were drowned in the rivers and washed away, or had their bodies buried privately by fellow gang members or family. Many of the wounded probably didn't seek or receive hospital treatment. Interestingly, Governor Seymour stated that, quote, more than 1,000 people, end quote, had been killed. And he had good reason to downplay the violence, with him being the governor and, kind of in charge of his people's safety. And the police superintendent at the time said that he believed 1,155 people had been killed. Social historian Herbert Ashbury estimated that 2,000 people were killed and 8,000 were wounded, and the vast majority of them were rioters, while other historians believe that around 100, 125 is a more appropriate number. All right, so now let's talk about the aftermath and ramifications of this draft riot. The federal government investigated the draft riots, but took no other action. Neither political party wanted too much attention on it because the Democrats' record was lawless and shameful, and the Republicans were the ones who were actively conducting the draft. No one was ever identified as a leader or planner of the draft riots. In the end, only 19 people were tried and convicted and served an average of 5 years in prison. President Lincoln soon reversed the temporary draft suspension and ignored Governor Seymour's request for a permanent suspension in New York State. Lincoln did, however, lower New York's quota from 26,000 to 12,000 men. He also allowed the Tammany Hall Democrats to conduct the next draft selection, but also had 20,000 federal troops and 3 batteries of artillery in town to keep the peace. The second attempt at the New York draft occurred peacefully on August 19th, 1863, just about a month after the draft riots. So what happened to all the men who were drafted? Of the 4 national draft calls between 1863 and 1864, 776,829 names were drawn. Of these, only 46,347, which is less than 1/17th, were sworn into service. Historians by the name of Spahn noted that of the 158,000 men whose names were drawn in the New York State, only 3,210 were actually drafted. The rest either volunteered or paid for substitutes. Big city political machines like Tammany Hall distributed money to hire substitutes, solidifying their support in the slums. Businesses bought exemptions for drafted workers, quote, draft insurance societies, offered $300 policies for premiums of just a few dollars a month, and quack doctors happily provided disability statements for a fee. Bounty brokers gladly accepted payments for men whom everyone knew would desert at the first opportunity. Historian James M. McPherson wrote, quote, "It was not a conscription at all, but a clumsy carrot and stick device to stimulate volunteering," end quote. In 1864, Congress rescinded the draft law's hated $300 commutation and substitute clause. Surprisingly, later studies showed virtually no correlation between social class, personal wealth, and the prevalence of commutation. New York historian Edward Robb Ellis wrote, quote, "The draft riots stand as the most brutal, tragic, and shameful episode in the entire history of New York City. Politicians encouraged mob violence. Law and order broke down. Mob seized control of America's largest city. Innocents were tortured and slaughtered, and the Union Army was weakened," end quote. Despite all this, New York City still supplied the Union with 15,000 soldiers and contributed $400 million to the war effort. They produced the most supplies of any city for the North and paid the most in taxes, bond purchases, and donations. There were also 8 all-Irish regiments from New York City that fought for the Union. So you could say that New York City was full of contradictions on where it stood in the war. In my opinion, the biggest ramification is that 10,000 Union soldiers, fresh off a win at the Battle of Gettysburg, were forced to march to New York City to stop the rioting. These troops could have been used to pursue the Confederate Army while they had the momentum, but couldn't. It's crazy to think that this riot basically halted the Union Army. One article that I read had a historian saying that the Manhattan draft riots were one of the Confederates' biggest wins. The war didn't end until April 9th, 1865, so who knows what those 10,000 Union troops could have done if they hadn't been required to stop the Manhattan draft riots. In terms of race relations, in 1869, a proposal to eliminate the property qualification for black voters was rejected by the electorate in New York State. Black people in the city did not obtain the vote on an equal basis with white people until 3/4 of the states ratified the 15th Amendment in the U.S. Constitution in March 1870. And in a sad twist of fate, 850,000 artifacts from an early 1990s archaeological excavation of a block of the Five Points neighborhood was stored in a sub-basement room in one of the World Trade Towers and were completely destroyed on 9/11. Only 18 artifacts on loan to the South Street Seaport Museum survive to this day. In conclusion, the Manhattan Draft Riots of 1863 were more than just an explosion of anger against a wartime draft. They were a stark reflection of the deep divisions and inequalities that shaped America at the time, and in many ways still shape it today. Over 4 days, what began as a protest against perceived class injustice spiraled into one of the darkest episodes of racial violence in American history, leaving scars on New York City that would linger for decades. The riots were fueled by a perfect storm of factors: influx of immigrants, economic disparity, political corruption, racial tensions, and the fear of change brought on by the Emancipation Proclamation. Poor, predominantly Irish immigrants saw the draft as yet another burden imposed on them by the wealthy elite who could afford to buy their way out. This frustration, coupled with a history of anti-Black sentiment and competition for jobs, turned their anger towards the city's Black population, resulting in horrific violence and devastation. As we look at America today, it's hard not to draw parallels. Conversations about economic inequality, systemic racism, immigration, and political corruption remain front and center in our national discourse. The idea of a rich man's war and a poor man's fight resonates in discussions about who bears the brunt of modern conflicts, both militarily and societally. And while we've made significant progress in many areas, the persistence of racial and economic divides remind us how much work is still left to do. The Manhattan Draft Riots are a sobering reminder of what can happen when fear and inequality go unchecked. History challenges us to confront the roots of our own biases and helps us to recognize the human cost of policies and rhetoric that divides us. History doesn't just teach us about the past. It gives us a mirror to examine the present and a guide to shape a better future. Thanks for joining me on this journey into history's hidden corners. Until next time, keep chasing your curiosity and keep learning out loud. Today's episode, don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave a review. And as always, let us know what you think or what topics you'd like to explore next by reaching out to me on social media or through the email. And all links to that are in the episode description. Thanks.